In 1930, William Haines was Hollywood's biggest star, earning more than the U.S. president. 5 years later, he was completely erased. The reason? MGM's ruthless ultimatum: dump your male partner or lose everything. Haines didn't hesitate. He chose the man he loved, throwing away his crown and triggering a brutal 50-year blacklist. This is the story of the one romance that broke Hollywood. William Billy Haines was born on the first day of the 20th century in Virginia. When he was still a teenager, he fled his hometown, sprinting directly toward the pure independence offered by the massive DuPont nitrocellulose plant in Hopewell, a boomtown built on munitions during the First World War. This factory work was a daily gamble with death, where a single stray spark could obliterate entire buildings. It was in this brutal industrial crucible that Haines forged his psychological armor. He developed a razor-sharp survival instinct and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by authority. A young man who spends his formative years packing explosives does not easily flinch at intimidation. By the time his natural physical grace caught the eye of a talent scout and brought him to New York and eventually to the nascent studios of California in 1922, he had already survived the worst of industrial America. He arrived carrying an air of detached amusement, ready to face an industry that demanded a level of personal subjugation he was entirely unwilling to tolerate. When Haines arrived in Hollywood in 1922, the film industry was still fiercely trying to legitimize itself. It was a chaotic frontier town rapidly transforming into a monolithic, highly controlled factory system. Having already survived the worst of industrial America and the cutthroat streets of New York, he arrived carrying an air of detached amusement, treating the burgeoning studio system with a healthy dose of cynicism. He quickly found his specific niche on camera. The studios, recognizing his natural irreverence and boundless energy, capitalized on his personality, casting him repeatedly as the wisecracker. He was the handsome, arrogant college boy, the cocky Marine, the brash athlete. In film after film, such as Brown of Harvard and Tell It to the Marines, he played the slightly obnoxious young go-getter who needed to be humbled by circumstances before ultimately winning the girl and the day in the final reel. It was a highly lucrative, perfectly calibrated formula. Audiences adored his energy, his athletic grace, and his sheer modernity. He represented the jazz age youth in its purest form. Before Haines, male cinematic stars were largely categorized into distinct extreme archetypes. They were either exotic, brooding swashbucklers like Rudolph Valentino or physical comedians like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. Haines offered something entirely new. He was the guy next door, but sharper, faster, and infinitely more confident. He wore collegiate sweaters and polo shirts with an effortless style that young men across America rushed to emulate. He was the first truly modern leading man projecting an accessible yet aspirational masculinity. The box office receipts were staggering. Thousands of fan letters flooded the MGM mailroom every single week. He became the studio's most reliable asset, a golden goose that practically printed money every time a new picture was released. Yet, the persona on screen was a carefully constructed mask, a highly profitable illusion maintained by an army of publicists. The tension between the public mask and the private truth began to stretch tight. Off-screen, Haines was fiercely intelligent, sophisticated, and deeply skeptical about the machinery of fame. He recognized early on that the studio heads viewed actors not as independent artists, but as livestock. They owned your image, your time, and increasingly, they demanded total jurisdiction over your private life. He played the game on the sound stages, delivering the required smirks and witty dialogue. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, he refused to play the subservient employee. He was known as the sharpest wit at any Hollywood gathering, unafraid to mock the executives who signed his checks. He navigated the social hierarchy of Los Angeles with the same fearless agility he had used on Wall Street and in Greenwich Village. The trap of success was closing around him. The more money he made for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the more valuable his public image became, and consequently, the more heavily the studio sought to protect that investment. He was surrounded by a system built entirely on the management of perception. Stars were routinely assigned fake biographies, fake birthplaces, and fake romances. Haines watched his colleagues bend to the will of the publicity departments, sacrificing their own realities to maintain their positions on the marquees. He saw the sheer terror in the eyes of other actors whose secrets were leveraged against them by the studio fixers. But Haines had survived the nitrocellulose vats. He had survived the poverty of New York. He possessed an innate, unshakable core of self-worth that no studio contract could purchase. He was standing at the absolute summit of the entertainment world, holding unprecedented power right at the moment a quiet, unassuming former sailor walked into his life, unknowingly setting the stage for the greatest act of rebellion the studio system had ever witnessed. The physical architecture of a 1920s Hollywood studio was designed to resemble a fortress. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer occupied over 100 acres in Culver City, surrounded by towering concrete walls and patrolled by a private police force. Once an actor passed through the iron gates on Washington Boulevard, they ceased to be an independent citizen of the United States. They became an asset within a sovereign territory. This walled city operated under its own laws, its own economy, and its own ruthless hierarchy. At the absolute apex of this hierarchy sat the studio bosses, men like Jack Warner, Harry Cohn, and most significantly for this narrative, Louis B. Mayer, operated less like business executives and more like feudal monarchs. They had clawed their way up from poverty, many of them immigrants who had started in the scrap metal or garment trades before recognizing the immense profitability of projected light. Because they had built this industry from nothing, they felt an absolute proprietary ownership over everything and everyone within its borders. Louis B. Mayer was the most formidable of them all. He possessed a complex, volatile psychology that dictated the fates of thousands of employees. He was a man who worshiped the concept of the idealized American family, a concept he aggressively exported to the world through MGM's films. He demanded that his movies reflect a universe where virtue was rewarded, mothers were revered, and traditional masculinity was triumphant. Mayer viewed the stars he contracted not as adult professionals, but as his children. He required their absolute loyalty and obedience. If an actor pleased him, Mayer could be overwhelmingly generous, showering them with bonuses and weeping openly during their contract renewals. If an actor defied him, his vengeance was total. He utilized his power to blacklist, to financially ruin, and to publicly humiliate anyone who threatened the stability of his artificial family. The stars were highly paid, but they were entirely stripped of agency. The primary instrument of this control was the morality clause. It functioned as the ultimate leverage, a leash keeping the most famous people on earth in a state of permanent terror. To enforce this, studios developed internal intelligence agencies managed by fixers like Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling. Their greatest challenge was neutralizing any rumors of homosexuality, which threatened the entire economic engine of romantic cinema. The PR departments preemptively engineered masterpieces of corporate deception, the lavender marriage. They paired gay actors with compliant starlets, orchestrated fake courtships for the press, and enforced these sham marriages with ruthless efficiency. For many, this provided a lucrative camouflage, but it required a profound psychological compartmentalization. You either surrendered your authenticity to the publicity department, or you were systematically destroyed by the very machine that built you. The executives believed their architecture of illusion was indestructible, entirely unprepared for a star who would look at the fortress they had built and decide to simply walk out the front gates. William Haines had mastered the architecture of a very specific smile. On the sound stages of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, he deployed it with lethal precision. It was a smirk, really, radiating an invincible collegiate arrogance that audiences in the 1920s found utterly intoxicating. The studio had crystallized his persona into a highly marketable commodity known simply as the wisecracker. In the dark of the movie palaces, millions of Americans watched him play the quintessential modern youth. He was the brash, fast-talking upstart who moved through the world with a supreme sense of entitlement. He was the athletic hero who ignored the rules until the final act, always managing to win the girl and the game through sheer, unapologetic charm. This character was not a deep artistic stretch. It was a brilliant exaggeration of the very real defense mechanisms he had forged during his brutal years working in the munitions plants of Virginia. The studio executives believed they had captured the essence of the man on celluloid, packaging his natural defiance into a safe, digestible product for mass consumption. They assumed the man and the mask were identical. The man who stepped off the studio lot at the end of the day bore little resemblance to the superficial playboy on the posters. The private William Haines was a man of intense, almost intimidating intellectual clarity. While his peers spent their massive salaries on wild parties, gambling debts, and fleeting romances, Haines was quietly educating himself. He spent his time haunting antique stores and art galleries, developing a formidable eye for neoclassical design, 18th century European furniture, and modern art. He understood that the world he inhabited was entirely transactional, a place where affection was bought and sold by the publicity department. He looked at the frantic, terrified lives of his closeted co-stars, men who lived in constant dread of exposure, marrying women they did not love, merely to satisfy the morality clauses in their contracts. Haines viewed their compromises with a cold, clear-eyed disdain. He possessed a fundamental psychological rigidity when it came to his own identity. He refused to be diminished by the neurotic demands of his employers. He was willing to play the clown on screen, but he categorically refused to live a lie in his own home. This uncompromising mindset created a profound sense of isolation. Haines was surrounded by sycophants, studio spies, and people who wanted proximity to his fame. Yet he had no true anchor. He was a man standing at the absolute center of the universe, surrounded by thousands of people and entirely alone. He required a connection that existed outside the corrupting influence of the studio system, someone who was not impressed by the machinery of fame. That connection materialized in the most ordinary of circumstances during a trip to New York City in 1926. Haines had traveled back to the East Coast as a newly minted star, flush with studio money and carrying the unmistakable aura of Hollywood royalty. New York in the mid-1920s was a city moving at a frenetic pace, vibrating with the energy of the Jazz Age and the illicit thrill of the Prohibition era. Haines was walking down a street in Manhattan when he saw a young man who possessed a quality that was entirely absent in Los Angeles. His name was Jimmie Shields, though everyone called him Jimmie. Born in Pennsylvania, Shields was a few years younger than Haines, and he carried none of the aggressive ambition that defined the actors populating the studio casting rooms. He was a former sailor in the United States Navy, a quiet, strikingly handsome young man with a gentle demeanor who was currently working as a freelance extra and struggling to find his footing in the massive city. Jimmie was looking for stability, for safety, and for a quiet life. He was the absolute antithesis of the manic high-voltage energy that defined William Haines. When their paths crossed on that New York pavement, the attraction was immediate and profound. According to the accounts of their contemporaries, there was no prolonged courtship, no calculated maneuvering. Haines, a man accustomed to making rapid decisions in high-stakes environments, took one look at the quiet sailor and made a declaration that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. He simply told Jimmie that he was coming with him. Why would a man who had fought his way out of poverty, currently holding the most coveted position in the American entertainment industry, consciously choose to bind himself to a penniless extra? Haines was not naive. He understood the lethal mechanics of the studio system better than anyone. He knew that Louis B. Mayer and the morality enforcers demanded absolute adherence to the illusion of heterosexuality. By inviting another man into his life as a permanent partner, Haines was carrying a live explosive directly into the heart of his carefully constructed career. He was handing the studio the exact weapon they needed to destroy him. He did it anyway because Jimmie Shields represented the one thing the studio could never manufacture: absolute, unvarnished reality. Jimmie was a grounding force. He cared nothing for box office receipts. He ignored the studio hierarchy, and he was completely unimpressed by the sycophantic culture of Hollywood. He cared about Billy the man, not Haines the commodity. In Jimmie, Haines found a sanctuary from the relentless performance of his daily life. Returning home to a person who demanded nothing but authenticity was a psychological necessity for a man who spent 12 hours a day hitting his marks, delivering lines written by other people and projecting a fake personality for the cameras. Jimmie was the antidote to the poison of fame. He offered domesticity, quiet loyalty, and a steady, unwavering devotion that anchored Haines's volatile brilliance. It was a union of opposites that forged an unbreakable bond. The decision to merge their lives was swift. Haines did not set Jimmie up in a discreet apartment in New York, nor did he attempt to hide him in the shadows of an East Coast retreat. He made a move of staggering audacity. He purchased train tickets, packed their bags, and brought Jimmie Shields directly back to Los Angeles. They boarded the luxurious Pullman cars of the Transcontinental Railroad, leaving the anonymity of the crowded New York streets behind. With every mile the train traveled westward, moving across the vast expanse of the American continent toward the sun-drenched, heavily monitored enclaves of Southern California. The stakes grew higher. Haines was returning to the center of his empire, bringing a partner into an environment designed to systematically eradicate exactly the kind of relationship they possessed. The studio fixers, the gossip columnists, and the executive boardrooms were waiting for his return. They expected their highly profitable leading man to step off the train ready to resume his duties, ready to escort starlets to premieres, and ready to maintain the illusion that generated millions of dollars. They were entirely unprepared for the reality that Haines was about to impose upon them. By bringing Jimmie to Hollywood, Haines was drawing a battle line. He was daring the system to look directly at the truth of his life. He was about to force the most powerful men in the industry into a confrontation they desperately wanted to avoid, setting in motion a timeline that would eventually force him to choose between his absolute dominance of the silver screen and the only true connection he had ever known. For Jimmie Shields, the decision to board that westbound train required absolute vulnerability. It was a leap into an entirely alien and hostile world. He was a man of modest background, accustomed to the regimented life of a naval sailor and the hardscrabble existence of a New York working man. He was entering a gilded cage populated by the most ruthless and self-absorbed individuals on the planet. He had no wealth of his own, no standing in the industry, and no protection other than the man sitting beside him. He was completely dependent on a movie star whose livelihood depended on the fickle adoration of millions of strangers. If Haines ever faltered, or if the studio forced his hand, Jimmie would be the first casualty, discarded without a second thought by the fixers who managed the MGM payroll. Jimmie possessed a quiet courage that perfectly complemented Haines's loud defiance. He absorbed the terrifying reality of their situation and chose to stay, providing a silent, unshakable foundation that allowed Haines to navigate the treacherous waters of his profession. For Haines, the risk was equally existential and far more visible. Every interaction, every public appearance, every photograph taken from that point forward would carry the weight of a potential scandal. He was choosing to live his life without the safety net of plausible deniability. The executives at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer were not blind. They possessed an intricate network of informants. The moment Jimmie stepped off the train in Los Angeles and into Haines's waiting automobile, the intelligence apparatus of the studio would begin to catalog his presence. The men in the oak-paneled offices would immediately recognize the threat this quiet young man posed to their corporate asset. They would begin to calculate the exact moment and the exact method required to neutralize that threat. Haines knew that by bringing Jimmie into his home, he was essentially starting a stopwatch on his own career. The profound nature of their connection overrode the instinct for professional self-preservation. Haines had spent his entire life fighting the poverty of his childhood, fighting the lethal conditions of the munitions plant, and fighting to conquer the brutal hierarchy of Hollywood. He had achieved the ultimate victory, securing wealth and fame beyond comprehension, but he found the prize to be entirely hollow if he could not share it on his own terms. He refused to let the studio dictate the boundaries of his heart. The integration of Jimmie into his daily existence was a deeply human necessity. It was the desperate act of a man demanding the right to exist in his entirety. As the train finally pulled into the station in Los Angeles, the transition from the private world of their journey to the hyper-scrutinized reality of Hollywood was immediate. The flashbulbs popped, the reporters shouted questions, and the machinery of fame roared back to life. Haines stepped onto the platform, deploying his trademark cocky smile for the cameras, slipping effortlessly back into the persona that paid the bills. Right behind him, stepping into the glaring California sunlight, was Jimmie Shields. They moved through the crowd not as a star and a fan, nor as a boss and an employee, but as an undeniable unit. They were crossing the threshold into a walled city that demanded total conformity, carrying with them a secret that the system could not tolerate, and a devotion that the system could not break. The game had fundamentally changed, and the countdown to the inevitable collision between personal truth and absolute power had officially begun. Defying the era's secrecy, the residence William Haines established upon returning to Los Angeles was a sprawling, prominent estate located squarely in the center of the industry's social map. In an era where his closeted contemporaries were purchasing remote properties with high walls and separate entrances to hide their genuine lives, Haines took the opposite approach. He weaponized visibility. He moved Jimmie Shields into his home with the same casual authority with which he commanded a movie set. There were no press releases explaining Jimmie as a valet, a distant cousin, or a temporary house guest. There was no studio-manufactured female companion living in the primary bedroom to appease the gossip columnists. Haines simply integrated Jimmie into every facet of his daily existence, treating their partnership as an established, indisputable fact of Hollywood geography. This was an act of architectural and social defiance. By refusing to hide, Haines challenged the studio's foundational belief that an actor's private life was a shameful secret requiring corporate management. Inside this home, Haines began to exercise the aesthetic brilliance that would later become his salvation. He stripped away the heavy, oppressive Spanish colonial decor that dominated Southern California real estate at the time. He replaced it with an environment entirely of his own creation, importing 18th century English antiques, installing hand-painted neoclassical wallpaper, and utilizing a stark, dramatic color palette. The house was not merely a shelter, it was a psychological fortress. It was an environment over which Louis B. Mayer and the Metro Goldwyn Mayer Publicity Department held zero jurisdiction. Within those walls, the exhausting machinery of the wisecracker persona was entirely dismantled. The man who walked through the front door at the end of a 14-hour shooting day was not the brash, arrogant star the public paid to see. He was a meticulous, highly cultured man returning to his chosen partner. Jimmie Shields stepped into the role of managing this complex domestic ecosystem. He possessed none of the narcissistic ambition that fueled the actors and directors who orbited Haines. He did not want a screen test. He did not seek out the cameras. Instead, he provided the infrastructural stability that allowed Haines to survive the brutal demands of the studio system. Jimmie managed the household staff, oversaw the meticulous maintenance of the antiques, and coordinated the logistics of their increasingly complicated lives. More importantly, he served as the emotional ballast for a man operating under catastrophic pressure. When Haines returned home, vibrating with the adrenaline and rage generated by clashes with studio executives, Jimmie absorbed the impact. He offered a quiet, unwavering loyalty that existed entirely outside the transactional nature of the motion picture industry. For Haines, the house was the only location on earth where he was not a commodity, and Jimmie was the sole individual who guaranteed that sanctuary. Integrating Jimmie into the vicious, highly stratified social hierarchy of Los Angeles required a masterful display of social engineering. Hollywood society in the late 1920s was effectively a corporate extension of the studios. Dinner parties and weekend gatherings were not leisure activities. They were brutal arenas for networking, solidifying alliances, and establishing dominance. If an actor fell out of favor with the executives, their social invitations evaporated overnight. Haines bypassed this hierarchy by establishing his own absolute center of gravity. He possessed a devastating, lightning-fast wit that made him the most coveted guest in the city. Hostesses desperate to secure his presence for their events quickly learned an unspoken but rigid rule. If William Haines was invited, James Shields was seated at the same table. Haines refused to attend any function where his partner was marginalized or excluded. He weaponized his own popularity, forcing the most powerful producers, directors, and actors to accept Jimmie simply because they could not afford to lose Haines's presence. Those who balked at the arrangement found themselves subjected to Haines's legendary lacerating sarcasm, effectively exiling themselves from the inner circle of the Hollywood elite. Recognizing the power he wielded, Haines completely inverted the social dynamic. He stopped seeking validation at the estates of the studio bosses and began hosting his own legendary Sunday afternoon gatherings. These parties became the epicenter of the Hollywood social scene. The driveway was packed with the custom-built Duesenbergs and Pierce arrows of the most famous individuals on the planet. To step into the Haines residence on a Sunday was to cross a distinct border into a subversive territory. The strict puritanical rules enforced by the studio publicity departments were suspended at the front door. At these gatherings, the heavily monitored stars of the era could drop their guard. They drank bootleg gin during Prohibition, shed their studio-mandated personas, and existed without the terrifying gaze of the fixers. The guest list was a staggering assembly of cinematic royalty. Clark Gable, Carol Lombard, George Cukor, and Marion Davies were regular attendees. They came because Haines was the ultimate host, but they also came because his home represented a level of authenticity that was starved out of their daily lives. At the center of this social orbit was Joan Crawford. She was one of MGM's most valuable assets, a woman who had clawed her way up from a traumatic childhood to become the ultimate symbol of cinematic glamour. Crawford was entirely a creation of the studio system, operating under immense psychological strain to maintain her position. She formed a profound, unbreakable alliance with Billy and Jimmie. She recognized in them a genuine partnership that stood in stark contrast to the hollow arranged marriages orchestrated by the publicity department. Crawford frequently sought refuge in their home, shedding the suffocating weight of her stardom. She observed the quiet, steady devotion Jimmie offered and the fierce, protective loyalty Billy displayed in return. Years later, speaking of their dynamic during this era, Crawford delivered a statement that cut through decades of industry hypocrisy, definitively calling them the happiest married couple in Hollywood. The existence of this open relationship presents a historical paradox. The intelligence network commanded by Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling missed nothing. Louis B. Mayer was fully aware that his most profitable leading man was cohabitating with another man right in the middle of Los Angeles, hosting parties attended by the studio's top earners. He knew that Haines was violating the core tenets of the morality clause every single day. Yet, from the moment Jimmie stepped off the train in 1926 until the early 1930s, the studio machine took no definitive action to separate them. The executives did not raid the house. They did not issue the devastating ultimatums that destroyed other careers. They chose a strategy of aggressive, intentional blindness. The mechanism of this tolerance was built entirely on mathematics. The studio system was a ruthless capitalist enterprise, and moral outrage was always subordinate to the balance sheet. William Haines was generating staggering amounts of revenue. His films were cheap to produce, requiring no massive historical sets or expensive special effects, yet they consistently broke box office records. He possessed a unique demographic hold on the American public. Men found his athletic swagger relatable, while women were mesmerized by his charm. Theater owners across the Midwest and the Deep South demanded a constant supply of William Haines pictures. because they guaranteed sold-out auditoriums. The Quigley Publications poll, the definitive metric of a star's financial value, repeatedly placed him at the absolute pinnacle of the industry. Louis B. Mayer operated on a simple, brutal calculus. As long as the ticket buyers in Ohio and Kansas believed the illusion on the screen, he was willing to ignore the reality occurring in the Hollywood Hills. The executives engaged in a desperate game of psychological compartmentalization. They convinced themselves that Haines's private life was an eccentric aberration that could be contained, provided it never reached the front pages of the national syndicates. They relied on their control of the press to maintain the firewall between Haines's public persona and his domestic reality. The gossip columnists who frequently attended the Sunday parties and saw Jimmie firsthand remained silent. They knew that exposing MGM's golden boy would result in their immediate banishment from the studio lot, cutting off their access to the stars, and effectively ending their careers in journalism. This economic shield, however, required Haines to maintain a flawless, exhausting streak of professional perfection. He was living on borrowed time, operating under the implicit understanding that his personal freedom was entirely dependent on his financial supremacy. He could not afford a single failure. Every movie release was a referendum on his right to exist authentically. If a picture flopped, the protective barrier of profitability would thin, and the moral enforcers waiting in the executive suites would strike. Haines worked relentlessly, churning out films at a punishing pace. He hit his marks, delivered the requisite smirks, and kept the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer coffers overflowing. While Haines successfully maintained this economic shield through relentless work, the psychological toll of this precarious existence fell heavily on Jimmie Shields. He occupied a deeply vulnerable position. He was surrounded by unimaginable wealth and glamour, yet he possessed zero structural power. He was fully aware that if the box office receipts ever faltered or if the studio's fragile tolerance snapped, he would be the primary target. The fixers would not attack Haines directly. They would attack the anomaly. They would attempt to deport him, frame him, or physically intimidate him into leaving town. Jimmie lived every day knowing that his presence was a direct affront to the most powerful men in California. Yet he maintained his quiet composure, refusing to be driven away by the invisible pressure radiating from Culver City. The arrangement they had constructed was a miracle of defiance, but it was fundamentally unsustainable. They were attempting to maintain a localized zone of absolute truth within an industry completely dedicated to the mass production of deception. The equilibrium held for 7 years solely because of the sheer force of Haines's popularity. But as the roaring 20s collapsed into the Great Depression, the cultural landscape of America began to fracture. The carefree, affluent youth persona that Haines projected was about to clash violently with the grim economic reality facing the nation. The audiences who once cheered for the arrogant college boy were now standing in bread lines, and their tolerance for Hollywood excess was rapidly turning into bitter resentment. The ground beneath their feet was shifting, and the economic shield that had protected their open secret was preparing to shatter. The absolute collapse of the American economy at the end of 1929 did not merely decimate bank accounts. It fundamentally rewired the psychology of the movie-going public. The extravagant, champagne-soaked illusions of the 1920s, which had fueled the meteoric rise of the Hollywood studio system, abruptly lost their intoxicating power. As the Great Depression tightened its grip across the continent, millions of citizens lost their homes, their employment, and their dignity. Bread lines stretched around city blocks in Chicago and sprawling shanty towns, bitterly dubbed Hoovervilles, erupted in the shadows of industrial centers. The ticket buyer, who previously sought out cinematic fantasies of immense wealth and carefree rebellion, now walked into the darkened theaters carrying a profound, simmering resentment. The cultural zeitgeist shifted violently from aspiration to survival. This economic devastation posed a direct, lethal threat to the specific cinematic identity William Haines had perfected. For 7 years, he had generated massive profits by playing the arrogant Ivy League playboy. He projected a brand of wealthy, entitled youth that thrilled audiences during the economic boom. By 1932, a starving, desperate populace found that exact persona deeply offensive. The wisecracker was no longer a charming rebel. He was a symbol of the out-of-touch elite. The executives at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer tracked this shifting demographic data with absolute cold-blooded precision. The studio was not an independent creative collective. It was a massive corporate entity, entirely beholden to the powerful financial institutions on Wall Street. The banks that underwrote the enormous costs of film production demanded stability and guaranteed returns on their investments. They viewed the moral reputation of the studios as a critical financial metric. If a studio became embroiled in controversy, the banks threatened to call in their loans, effectively bankrupting the enterprise overnight. Louis B. Mayer and his production chief Irving Thalberg recognized that the era of looking the other way was permanently over. The threat did not merely emanate from anxious bankers in New York. A highly organized, fiercely militant moral crusade was mobilizing across the United States, targeting the motion picture industry with unprecedented ferocity. The Catholic Legion of Decency, operating with the full backing of the church hierarchy, transformed moral outrage into an economic weapon. Millions of congregants stood in their pews on Sunday mornings, raising their hands and taking a solemn oath to boycott any film and any theater that promoted indecency. They did not just target individual movies. They threatened to embargo entire cinema chains, striking directly at the primary revenue streams of the major studios. This was not a fringe movement. It was a massive, highly disciplined demographic that held the power to shatter the Hollywood monopoly. To appease this looming threat, the studios empowered Will H. Hays to draft and enforce the production code. The code was a draconian, obsessively detailed set of censorship rules that dictated exactly what could be projected on screen. It banned any depiction of sexual deviance, mandated that all cinematic crimes be punished before the final reel, and demanded that the institution of marriage be upheld as sacred. The enforcement of the production code extended far beyond the fictional narratives of the scripts. The civic leagues and religious organizations demanded that the human beings starring in the films embody the exact same sanitized, purified morality in their private lives. The actors were required to serve as living, breathing advertisements for traditional American values. This new, militarized moral environment instantly transformed William Haines from a highly profitable asset into a catastrophic corporate liability. His refusal to participate in a lavender marriage, his open cohabitation with Jimmie Shields, and his brazen rejection of the studio's camouflage protocols were no longer viewed as the eccentricities of a top-tier star. They were reclassified as a direct provocation to the Legion of Decency. The executives in Culver City initiated a ruthless internal audit of their roster, calculating the specific risk each actor posed to the studio's survival. The mathematics of Haines's career had fundamentally changed. his box office receipts were beginning to soften, reflecting the public's exhaustion with the wealthy playboy archetype. The immense financial shield that had protected his domestic life with Jimmie was thinning, leaving him entirely exposed to the moral enforcers waiting in the executive suites. The studio machinery, which had spent years utilizing its vast intelligence network to hide his reality, abruptly reversed its function. The protective perimeter maintained by the publicity department was quietly, deliberately withdrawn. Howard Strickling ceased killing the rumors. The studio fixers stopped intimidating the gossip columnists. A subtle, highly orchestrated freeze-out began. Haines was left operating without a safety net, navigating an industry that was actively preparing to offer him up as a sacrificial lamb to prove its adherence to the new moral order. The precipitating event, the exact moment the system decided to spring the trap, occurred in the early months of 1933. The location was the Young Men's Christian Association building in downtown Los Angeles. The imposing brick structure at 7th and Hope Street served a specific dual purpose in the 1930s. On the surface, it provided cheap, respectable lodging for transient workers, commercial travelers, and off-duty military personnel navigating the crushing poverty of the Depression. However, within the highly policed, morally rigid confines of Los Angeles, it also functioned as a crucial underground sanctuary for the city's marginalized gay population. It was a known, albeit highly dangerous, environment where men could seek out connections away from the aggressive surveillance of their neighborhoods and workplaces. The Los Angeles Police Department, operating under immense political pressure from the mayor's office to clean up the city's image, routinely targeted these specific institutions. The vice squads did not merely patrol the streets, they utilized sophisticated entrapment tactics. Plainclothes officers infiltrated the YMCA, loitering in the gymnasiums, the steam rooms, and the hallways, actively soliciting advances in order to secure arrests. The police operated in a symbiotic, highly corrupt relationship with the major studios. Under normal circumstances, if a high-profile actor stumbled into a vice squad sting, the arresting officers immediately recognized the financial value of their captive. They would delay the booking process, allowing a phone call to be placed to the studio's chief fixer, Eddie Mannix. William Haines frequented the downtown Los Angeles YMCA. He moved through the world with the absolute ingrained confidence of a man who believed his status rendered him untouchable. On this specific night in March 1933, that confidence was violently dismantled. The details recorded in the police blotters and historical archives confirm that Haines was arrested in a room accompanied by a sailor. The physical execution of the vice bust was swift, brutal, and designed to induce maximum terror. The sudden breach of the heavy wooden door, the shouting of the undercover officers, the immediate physical restraint, and the humiliating march through the corridors of the building to the waiting police wagon constituted a standard operational procedure meant to break the spirit of the accused. For an ordinary citizen, an arrest on a morals charge in 1933 was an apocalyptic event. It guaranteed the immediate loss of employment, total social ostracization, public exposure in the morning newspapers, and a high probability of severe physical violence within the confines of the city jail. For a movie star possessing the global magnitude of William Haines, the arrest represented a corporate crisis capable of destroying millions of dollars in future box office revenue. As the heavy iron doors of the holding cell locked behind him, Haines likely expected the familiar, well-oiled machinery of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer crisis management team to engage. He had witnessed other stars dragged out of far worse situations. The protocol was established. The studio lawyers would arrive before dawn, the desk sergeant would be heavily compensated, the paperwork would be incinerated, and a studio limousine would quietly transport him back to the safety of his estate before the press corps even awakened. He sat in the grim, concrete holding cell of the Los Angeles precinct, waiting for the intervention that he believed his immense value to the studio guaranteed. He waited for Eddie Mannix to walk through the door with a briefcase full of cash and the authority of Louis B. Mayer backing him. But the hours ticked by, the dawn broke over the city, and the expected rescue never materialized. The silence from Culver City was absolute and terrifying. The fix did not go in. The police blotter remained unaltered. The arresting officers proceeded with the standard booking procedures, completely ignoring the massive celebrity status of their prisoner. This absence of intervention was not an oversight. It was a calculated, lethal executive decision, orchestrated directly from the highest levels of the studio hierarchy. Louis B. Mayer possessed the absolute power to make the YMCA arrest vanish from reality. He chose instead to let the trap snap shut entirely. Mayer allowed the scandal to percolate through the precinct, fully aware that the information would immediately leak to the aggressive, independent press outlets that the studio did not directly control. He permitted the crisis to escalate because he recognized the YMCA incident not as a disaster, but as the ultimate piece of leverage. Mayer had spent years trying to break Haines's defiance, attempting to force him into a manufactured lavender marriage and demanding the expulsion of Jimmie Shields. Haines had continually outmaneuvered him, shielded by his massive popularity and the revenue he generated. But the Depression had weakened that shield, and the YMCA arrest completely shattered it. By deliberately withholding the studio's protection, Mayer engineered a scenario where Haines was entirely isolated, stripped of his power, and facing total public ruin. The arrest was publicized, sending shockwaves through the industry and providing the Legion of Decency with the exact type of scandal they utilized to destroy careers. The terrified, heavily controlled environment of Hollywood watched in stunned silence as the most bankable star in America was publicly humiliated without a shred of corporate defense. The Vice Squad sting at the YMCA was merely the mechanical preamble to the true execution. It was the application of maximum pressure designed to soften the target. Louis B. Mayer had successfully cornered his most rebellious asset. He had orchestrated the exact conditions necessary to force the issue. The public arrest was the definitive signal that the era of tolerance was dead. The stage was now meticulously set for the ultimate confrontation, a brutal face-to-face reckoning scheduled to take place within the soundproof oak-paneled walls of the studio chief's office, where William Haines would be forced to make the most consequential decision in the history of the motion picture industry. The summons to the executive suites at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was not an invitation. It was a subpoena from a sovereign power. When William Haines was ordered to report to Louis B. Mayer's office following the YMCA arrest, the entire studio apparatus was watching. The physical walk from the sound stages to the executive building was a meticulously designed exercise in psychological subjugation. Haines traversed the bustling lot, moving past the massive electrical cables, the frantic grips, and the extras in period costumes, towards the imposing neoclassical facade of the administration building. This was the nervous system of the empire. Inside, the atmosphere shifted radically. The chaotic noise of production vanished, replaced by the hushed, heavily carpeted silence of absolute authority. The anterooms were staffed by secretaries who controlled access to the men who controlled the global film industry. Haines was made to wait, a deliberate tactic employed to induce anxiety and reinforce the power dynamic before the heavy doors finally opened. Louis B. Mayer's office was constructed to intimidate. It was a vast cavernous space lined with dark oak paneling and dominated by a massive semicircular desk. Mayer, a man of short stature, had customized the architecture to his advantage. His desk was situated on a slightly raised platform, forcing anyone seated opposite him to physically look up. The chair designated for the talent was intentionally positioned lower, creating an immediate physical hierarchy. Mayer utilized this space not just as an office, but as a theatrical stage where he performed the role of the benevolent yet terrifying patriarch. He possessed an uncanny ability to summon tears on command, pivoting violently from weeping sentimentality to apocalyptic rage within the span of a single sentence. He used this emotional volatility to disorient and break the highly strung artists under his control. Countless stars, directors, and writers had sat in that lower chair and surrendered their dignity, their creative autonomy, and their private lives to secure their weekly paychecks. On this specific morning in 1933, Mayer dispensed with the theatrical tears. The situation with the YMCA vice sting had breached the perimeter of his tolerance. The financial pressures of the Great Depression, coupled with the militant threats from the Catholic Legion of Decency, meant that Mayer needed absolute compliance. He looked at Haines not as a beloved son, but as a defective piece of highly expensive machinery that required immediate recalibration. Mayer laid out the reality of the situation with brutal clarity. He possessed the police reports. He controlled the narrative that would be released to the press. He held the power to either incinerate the evidence or hand it directly to the syndicated gossip columns, which would result in Haines being completely exiled from civilized society. Mayer established the absolute leverage he held, making it definitively clear that Haines possessed no bargaining power. Mayer then presented the solution. It was a standard prepackaged crisis management protocol that the studio fixers had utilized dozens of times before. The ultimatum consisted of 3 non-negotiable directives. First, the studio would issue a blanket denial of the YMCA incident, framing it as a misunderstanding or a malicious rumor fabricated by rival studios. Second, Haines would immediately submit to a lavender marriage. Howard Strickling in the publicity department had already compiled a list of suitable, compliant female starlets on the MGM payroll who were desperate enough for leading roles to participate in the charade. A swift, highly publicized engagement would be announced to the national press, followed by a heavily photographed wedding. This would provide the necessary visual evidence to appease the civic leagues and neutralize the threat of a boycott. The third and final directive was the core of the ultimatum. It was the absolute permanent expulsion of Jimmie Shields. Jimmie was the anomaly, the living proof of Haines's defiance, and the source of the studio's exposure. Mayer demanded that Shields be evicted from the Los Angeles estate immediately. He was to be given a train ticket out of California and paid a sum of hush money, provided he signed an airtight non-disclosure agreement. He was to vanish from Haines's life, never to return, never to be seen in public with the star, and never to be mentioned again. If Haines accepted these 3 conditions, the YMCA arrest would disappear, his contract would be renewed, and he would retain his status as the #1 male box office attraction in America, complete with the massive salary and the global fame. If he refused, Mayer promised total professional and social annihilation. Haines sat in the lower chair, listening to the terms of his own execution. Sitting in that oak-paneled room, faced with Mayer's stark binary choice, the era of evasion ended. He recognized that the financial safety net had entirely evaporated. The protective shield was gone. He was stripped down to the absolute core of his identity. If he signed the agreement, he would keep the mansion, the Duesenberg, and the applause. But he understood the psychological cost with terrifying clarity. He would become a hostage in his own life, a highly paid puppet required to perform his heterosexuality 24 hours a day. He would have to look Jimmie Shields in the eye, hand him a train ticket, and betray the only genuine, uncorrupted relationship he had ever experienced, simply to appease a hypocritical corporate structure. He would join the ranks of his closeted co-stars, men who drank themselves to sleep in terror, locked in sham marriages orchestrated by men who viewed them as livestock. Haines possessed a rigid, uncompromising self-respect forged in the munitions factories of his youth. He refused to be reduced to property. He refused to participate in the destruction of his own soul. Without shedding a single tear or pleading for a compromise, he coldly assessed the most powerful man in the motion picture industry and made a decision that fundamentally altered the power dynamic of the room. He rejected the premise that his life belonged to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He looked directly at Louis B. Mayer and delivered a response that stripped away the entire illusion of the studio system. He spoke in a clear, unwavering voice, devoid of the wisecracking persona he utilized on screen. He simply stated, "I am already married." The statement was an act of profound linguistic rebellion. By utilizing the word married to describe his relationship with a man in 1933, Haines completely delegitimized the studio's authority. He claimed a status that neither the law nor the culture recognized, asserting a personal truth that superseded Mayer's corporate mandates. He validated Jimmie Shields not as a temporary companion or a shameful secret, but as his permanent equal partner. The sheer audacity of the statement paralyzed the room. Actors did not speak to studio chiefs in this manner. They did not claim autonomy. Before Mayer could recover from the initial shock of the refusal, Haines delivered the lethal blow. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. Louis B. Mayer tirelessly promoted himself as the ultimate guardian of family values. Yet his own private life was an open secret within the industry. Mayer was notorious for his aggressive pursuit of young actresses and his frequent thinly veiled extramarital affairs. Haines weaponized this hypocrisy. He leaned forward and told the studio chief, "I will give up Jimmie when you give up your wife." It was a calculated, devastating strike. Haines did not just refuse the ultimatum. He exposed the moral bankruptcy of the man delivering it. He equated his devotion to Jimmie with the sanctity of Mayer's own marriage, completely dismantling the moral high ground the executive attempted to claim. He slapped the face of absolute power. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Mayer, unaccustomed to any form of defiance, let alone a direct attack on his personal life, went apoplectic. The veneer of the benevolent patriarch completely shattered, replaced by raw, unhinged fury. The accounts of the meeting describe Mayer turning physically purple, screaming obscenities as the carefully controlled environment of his office devolved into chaos. Mayer did not merely fire him verbally. He demanded a physical manifestation of his absolute authority. He ordered his secretaries to retrieve the current highly lucrative contract binding William Haines to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. When the document was placed on the heavy wooden desk, Mayer took it in his hands and violently ripped it in half. The sound of the tearing paper signaled the definitive end of an era. Mayer screamed that Haines was finished. He declared that he would never work at MGM again, that his pictures would be pulled, and that he would personally ensure no other studio in the industry would ever hire him. Mayer activated the total eradication protocol. He threw the pieces of the contract to the floor, banishing his biggest star from the empire. Haines stood up from the subordinate chair. Offering no apologies and making no attempt to salvage his career, Haines simply turned his back on Louis B. Mayer and walked out of the oak-paneled office. He walked down the hushed corridors of the Thalberg building, past the stunned secretaries, and exited into the blinding California sunlight. He walked across the studio lot, a dead man walking in the eyes of the industry, but possessing an absolute, unshakable internal freedom. He had just detonated his own career, voluntarily setting fire to millions of dollars and a level of global fame that most humans could not even comprehend. He traded his crown for his dignity. The speed at which the studio machinery moved to execute Mayer's sentence was terrifying. Before Haines even reached the iron gates of the Culver City lot, the Blacklist was officially activated. The internal switchboards lit up. Directives were dispatched to every department. The publicity office immediately began erasing his name from upcoming promotional materials. The casting directors were ordered to strike him from all pending projects. Mayer picked up his private telephone lines and connected with the heads of the other major studios, Jack Warner at Warner Brothers, Daryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century, Harry Cohn at Columbia. He informed them that William Haines was permanently toxic. The studio chiefs operated as a cartel. When one monarch banished a subject, the others uniformly enforced the exile to maintain the discipline of the labor force. An invisible, impenetrable wall was instantly erected around Haines. The news spread through the sound stages and the commissaries with the speed of a shock wave. The community of actors, directors, and writers absorbed the brutal lesson Mayer intended to teach. The system had successfully demonstrated its ultimate power. If they could completely annihilate the #1 box office draw in the country in the span of a 15-minute meeting, no one was safe. The closeted stars who had attended Haines's legendary Sunday parties felt a cold, paralyzing terror. They witnessed the exact consequence of authenticity. The destruction of William Haines forced them deeper into the shadows, solidifying the power of the Lavender marriage and the absolute necessity of the studio fixers. The warning was clear: submit to the lie or cease to exist. Haines drove his Duesenberg back to his sprawling estate, the house he had meticulously designed, the sanctuary that was now entirely cut off from the economic engine that sustained it. He walked through the front door, leaving behind the wreckage of a historically unprecedented career, and faced Jimmie Shields. The life they had built, the fragile equilibrium they had maintained through sheer star power, was utterly demolished. They were now two men entirely isolated, marked for destruction by the most vindictive executives in America, standing at the precipice of an unknown, deeply hostile future. The narrative of the movie star was officially terminated. The narrative of survival against an apparatus designed to crush them completely was about to begin. The day after the confrontation in Louis B. Mayer's office, the most defining sound in William Haines's sprawling estate was an absolute suffocating silence. For 7 years, the telephones in that house had rung incessantly. They had brought daily offers from directors, invitations from eager hostesses, and rapid-fire demands from the publicity department. Now the lines were completely dead. The sheer speed of his eradication was a testament to the brutal efficiency of the Hollywood studio cartel. The Blacklist was not a physical document pinned to a bulletin board. It was an invisible, airtight embargo enforced through whispered phone calls between the half-dozen men who control the global entertainment monopoly. When Mayer dictated that Haines was finished, Jack Warner, Daryl Zanuck, and Harry Cohn immediately fell into line. This collusion wasn't driven by personal animosity toward the actor, but by a ruthless need to protect their own highly lucrative investments. They understood that if one star successfully defied the morality clause and survived, the entire labor force might suddenly realize their own power. The execution of this embargo extended far beyond the casting offices. It permeated the highly stratified social ecosystem of Los Angeles. Hollywood society was entirely transactional, a fragile network of alliances built exclusively on proximity to power and box office viability. Once the studio head signaled that Haines was toxic, a chilling, synchronized withdrawal occurred among the elite. The legendary Sunday afternoon gatherings at his home, once packed with the biggest names in the industry, simply ceased to exist. The custom-built Duesenbergs no longer crowded his driveway. Former colleagues, directors he had made millions for, and actors who had happily consumed his bootleg gin suddenly found reasons to look the other way when he entered a restaurant like the Brown Derby or the Trocadero. This social abandonment was not necessarily born of malice. It was born of absolute, paralyzing terror. The men and women who shunned him were entirely dependent on the studios for their survival. To be seen socializing with a blacklisted exile was to invite the devastating scrutiny of the fixers and the gossip columnists. Guilt by association was a tangible, lethal threat. The closeted actors who had sought refuge in Haines's authenticity were the quickest to sever ties. They retreated behind the heavy safety of their lavender marriages, terrified that the spotlight currently incinerating Haines's career would swing in their direction. They sacrificed their friend to appease the executives, leaving Haines and Jimmie completely isolated in an environment they used to rule. Haines absorbed this betrayal with a cynical, cold-eyed clarity. He had always suspected that the affection of Hollywood was merely a byproduct of his profitability, and the sudden freeze-out confirmed his deepest suspicions. Yet the loss of his social standing was secondary to a far more pressing crisis. The financial reality of their situation was rapidly deteriorating. The lifestyle of a top-tier movie star in the early 1930s required a massive, continuous influx of cash. The sprawling estate, the imported antiques, the tailored wardrobes, and the household staff had all been sustained by a weekly paycheck that dwarfed the salaries of corporate presidents. That revenue stream was now entirely severed, replaced by a terrifying void. Haines was not prepared to surrender his profession without a fight. Shut out of the major studios, he turned toward the gritty underbelly of the industry known as Poverty Row, attempting to resurrect his career through cheap independent films. But without the immense distribution networks, the marketing budgets, and the protective glow of MGM, he was suffocated by the cartel. The failure of his independent ventures was a devastating revelation. Haines realized that a movie star cannot exist in a vacuum. The era of William Haines, the leading man, was definitively over. As the reality of his exile set in, the emotional and financial strain within the walls of his home intensified. The bills continued to arrive, indifferent to his blacklisted status. The luxurious facade they had meticulously maintained began to crack. This is the juncture where the quiet, unyielding strength of Jimmie Shields became the absolute anchor of their survival. Haines, stripped of his lifelong identity and facing financial ruin, was highly vulnerable to the despair that consumed so many discarded Hollywood figures. It was a scenario tailor-made for the typical industry tragic ending: a rapid descent into alcoholism, bitter recriminations, and eventual self-destruction. Jimmie refused to let that narrative take hold. He did not possess the volatile, artistic temperament of his partner. He possessed the practical, grounded resilience of a man who had navigated the world without a safety net long before he arrived in California. Jimmie managed the decline with a steady hand. He took over the chaotic finances, meticulously reviewing their assets and liabilities. He recognized that they could no longer sustain the illusion of immense wealth. They had to downsize immediately and drastically to survive the siege. The painful process of dismantling their empire began. Jimmie organized the sale of the custom automobiles, replacing them with modest, unremarkable vehicles. He systematically reduced the household staff, taking on the heavy domestic responsibilities himself. They placed the sprawling, heavily decorated estate on the market, recognizing that the very walls they had built to protect themselves had become an unbearable financial liability. They packed up the carefully curated 18th century English antiques, the hand-painted wallpapers, and the remnants of a life funded by the studio machine. They moved out of the epicenter of Hollywood society and relocated to a smaller, less conspicuous house in the coastal community of El Porto, near Manhattan Beach. This retreat from the hills to the coast was a physical manifestation of their new reality. They were stepping away from the glare of the industry, seeking anonymity and a significantly lower cost of living. In El Porto, they were no longer royalty. They were two men trying to figure out how to navigate middle age without a profession. Haines struggled deeply with the loss of his audience and the sudden irrelevance of his talents. The silence of the phone was a daily agonizing reminder of his erased status. Yet amidst the profound loss, a crucial realization began to solidify. They had lost the Duesenberg, the mansion, and the applause. They had been betrayed by their peers and crushed by a corporate monopoly. But as they unpacked their belongings in the quiet beach house, far removed from the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills, they recognized exactly what they had retained. The studio fixers had failed in their primary objective. They had successfully destroyed the career, but they had not destroyed the men. Louis B. Mayer's ultimatum demanded the permanent expulsion of Jimmie Shields. Instead, Haines and Shields were sitting together in a smaller living room, their partnership intact, entirely free from the suffocating demands of the morality clauses and the PR department. They had survived the professional execution. They began to slowly recalibrate their lives, attempting to build a solid foundation that relied on no one but themselves. Haines possessed an incredible eye for design and a deep historical knowledge of architecture and furniture. Jimmie possessed the organizational skills to manage a business. They started discussing the possibility of turning Haines's legendary taste into a commercial enterprise, providing interior design services for the very industry that had expelled him. It was a fragile, highly uncertain plan, but it offered a path forward that did not require submitting to a casting director. They believed that the absolute worst was behind them. They assumed that by accepting their exile, liquidating their major assets, and retreating to the quiet margins of the city, the system would finally leave them alone. They believed that the punishment for their defiance was entirely economic and professional. This assumption was a grave, terrifying miscalculation. The machinery of moral panic, once activated, does not easily shut down. The public labeling of Haines as a deviant, facilitated by the studio's deliberate inaction during the YMCA arrest, had marked him with a highly visible target. The atmosphere in the United States in the mid-1930s was growing increasingly radicalized. The massive economic desperation of the Depression bred a dangerous, aggressive intolerance. Vigilante groups operating under the guise of civic purification began taking the enforcement of morality into their own hands. They were emboldened by the silent approval of local law enforcement and the inflammatory rhetoric of the decency leagues. Haines and Jimmie had moved to El Porto seeking peace, completely unaware that their exile had left them completely exposed. Stripped of the protective perimeter of the studio security apparatus, they were no longer untouchable celebrities. They were highly visible outcasts, living in a quiet beach community that was about to become the staging ground for a terrifying escalation of violence. The corporate assassination was complete, but the physical punishment was just about to begin. Moving to the coastal enclave of El Porto stripped Haines and Shields of their corporate armor. They assumed their quiet retreat would make the moral panic dissipate, but this severely underestimated the lingering toxicity of a ruined public image. They were no longer untouchable celebrities. They were entirely exposed to the whims of a highly volatile public. The socio-political climate of Southern California in 1936 was dangerously unstable, breeding militant vigilantism. The presence of a disgraced, openly gay former movie star provided extremist groups like the White Legion, a regional splinter of the Ku Klux Klan, with a perfect ideological target. The tension built slowly through slanderous whispers and aggressive surveillance, culminating in May 1936, when vigilantes manufactured a false rumor about Haines to justify a coordinated violent purge. The attack occurred late at night, under the cover of a heavy coastal fog. The sensory reality of that evening was defined by absolute isolation. The sound of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the shoreline masked the initial approach of the mob. Over 100 men gathered in the dark streets surrounding the small wooden house. They were armed with heavy flashlights, wooden clubs, and chains. They moved with military precision, completely sealing off the narrow alleyways and blocking any possible escape route. They cut the telephone wires connecting the house to the main grid. Haines and Shields were trapped inside a highly vulnerable structure, entirely severed from the outside world. When the mob finally breached the perimeter, they did not attempt a quiet infiltration. They shattered the front windows and battered down the heavy wooden door, swarming into the narrow living quarters. The violence was immediate and overwhelming. Haines and Shields possessed no weapons and no private security detail. They were two men facing a heavily armed, highly coordinated militia fueled by manufactured rage. The attackers dragged them out of their beds, tearing their clothes and subjecting them to a relentless barrage of physical blows. The mob hauled them out the broken front door and threw them directly onto the cold, wet sand of the beach. This was not a choreographed cinematic brawl. It was a raw, chaotic execution of brute force designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological damage. The men surrounding them shouted homophobic slurs, kicking and beating them with crude weapons. Haines, the man who had once commanded the absolute adoration of millions of fans, was repeatedly struck in the face and torso. Shields absorbed an equally savage beating, desperately trying to shield his partner from the heaviest blows. The attackers held them down in the sand, intentionally humiliating them while delivering a physical punishment meant to permanently maim. The sheer numbers of the mob made any form of self-defense mathematically impossible. They were at the absolute mercy of men who operated outside the boundaries of human empathy. The most terrifying aspect of the assault was the total silence from the surrounding community. Over 100 men do not execute a violent raid on a small beach house without generating a massive disturbance. Neighbors stood on their porches or watched through their curtains, actively witnessing the brutalization of two human beings. No one intervened. No one ran to the local precinct to demand assistance. The community had reached a silent consensus that the victims deserved their punishment. The mob eventually exhausted its rage. They issued a final screaming ultimatum, warning Haines and Shields that if they did not evacuate the neighborhood immediately, the next raid would result in their deaths. The attackers then dispersed back into the fog, leaving the two men bleeding and incapacitated on the sand. The aftermath of the violence exposed the absolute horrifying reality of their legal status. They managed to drag themselves back into the wreckage of their home. They were severely battered, requiring immediate medical attention. When the local police finally arrived at the scene hours later, their response confirmed the darkest suspicions about the justice system in 1930s Los Angeles. The officers walked through the shattered door, observed the extensive property damage, and looked at the severe injuries sustained by the two men. They took minimal notes. They asked hostile, accusatory questions, heavily implying that Haines and Shields had brought the violence upon themselves. The police blotter from that night remained intentionally vague. No massive manhunt was launched. No detectives were assigned to interview the neighbors or identify the leaders of the White Legion. The local precinct effectively buried the incident before the sun even rose over the Pacific. A mob of 100 men had committed home invasion, aggravated assault, and attempted murder, and the justice system completely closed its eyes. Haines and Shields realized a chilling truth. Because they had defied the moral dictates of the era, the state had essentially revoked their civil rights. They were legally designated as unprotected citizens. If they were murdered in their own home, the authorities would not expend the resources to prosecute the killers. The Hollywood studio system had stripped them of their livelihood, but the local government had stripped them of their fundamental humanity. The physical injuries slowly healed over the following weeks, but the psychological scars permanently altered their worldview. The attack forced them to confront the absolute vulnerability of their existence. They could not rely on the police. They could not rely on the community. They could legally be beaten to death on a public beach without any consequence to the perpetrators. This terrifying realization often shatters individuals, driving them toward extreme substance abuse or permanent psychological breakdown. Many victims of similar vigilante violence during that era simply disappeared, changing their names and living the rest of their lives in suffocating fear. Haines and Shields chose a different path. The brutal beating on the sand of El Porto catalyzed a fierce, unyielding resolve. They packed their remaining belongings and abandoned the heavily damaged beach house. They recognized that attempting to hide on the margins of society only made them easier targets for cowards operating in the dark. They needed a different strategy for survival. They needed to build a fortress that relied entirely on economic leverage rather than public anonymity or studio protection. If the world viewed them as defenseless outcasts, they would force the world to depend on their unparalleled expertise. The violence of the White Legion intended to break their spirits and drive them apart. It achieved the exact opposite. The shared trauma solidified their partnership into an unbreakable alliance. They had looked into the absolute abyss of human cruelty and survived it together. Haines, nursing bruised ribs and a shattered public image, decided to attack the very industry that had exiled him, utilizing the only weapon he had left. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of design and an uncompromising aesthetic vision. He knew the massive egos and the specific insecurities of the Hollywood elite better than anyone alive. He decided to commodify his taste, transforming his lifelong passion for interior architecture into an aggressive commercial enterprise. The men who had beaten him on the beach and the executives who had cheered his downfall assumed he was permanently defeated. They had no idea that William Haines was preparing to return to the absolute center of their world, not as an obedient employee begging for a contract, but as an indispensable dictator of style. The physical assault on the sands of El Porto eradicated any lingering illusions William Haines held about a quiet retirement. Retreating into the shadows had not provided safety. It had simply signaled vulnerability to cowards operating in the dark. In 1930s America, a man stripped of his institutional power and subjected to vigilante violence was expected to either flee the state or quietly succumb to despair. Haines and Jimmie Shields categorically refused to do either. As they recovered from their injuries in a rented apartment, they engaged in a ruthless, pragmatic assessment of their survival options. They could not outrun the bigotry of the era, and they could not rely on the protection of the law. They understood that in a capitalist society, the only impenetrable armor is absolute, undeniable economic indispensability. If they could not be loved by the public or protected by the studio, they had to become something far more resilient. They had to become necessary to the very people who had orchestrated their downfall. Haines possessed one remaining asset that Louis B. Mayer could not confiscate, and a mob could not beat out of him. He possessed an innate, highly cultivated architectural and aesthetic genius. Long before his exile, he had treated interior design not as a hobby, but as a rigorous academic discipline. He spent his off hours on studio sets studying the construction of lighting, the psychological impact of spatial arrangement, and the historical provenance of European antiques. He knew that the Hollywood elite, the studio bosses, the newly minted stars, the aggressive producers, were largely uneducated men and women who had clawed their way out of urban slums and immigrant enclaves. They possessed staggering, unprecedented wealth, but they were deeply, violently insecure about their lack of pedigree. They lived in massive, dark Spanish colonial mansions that looked like medieval fortresses, filled with heavy, depressing furniture that reeked of newly purchased money rather than generational class. They desperately wanted to look like European aristocracy, but they had absolutely no idea how to achieve it. Haines decided to weaponize that insecurity. He recognized that taste was a commodity that could be monopolized and sold at an astronomical premium. In 1936, he officially launched William Haines Designs. He did not open a modest antique stall in a forgotten corner of the city. He leased a prominent storefront right on the Sunset Strip, positioning himself directly in the daily sightline of the industry executives driving to and from their studios. It was an act of profound, calculated arrogance. He was planting his flag on the main artery of the empire that had banished him, daring them to look at him. The division of labor within this new enterprise was established immediately and permanently. Shields assumed absolute control over the logistics, the finances, and the heavily guarded privacy of their operation. Jimmie possessed the meticulous, grounded discipline necessary to negotiate with ruthless textile merchants, manage a team of craftsmen, and balance ledgers that would soon rival the budgets of independent films. He built the invisible infrastructure that allowed the business to function. Haines, meanwhile, stepped into the role of the flamboyant, dictatorial frontman. He designed the showrooms, sourced the rare antiques, and prepared to engage in psychological warfare with his potential client base. The critical hurdle was securing the first major commission. The studio Blacklist was still technically in effect, and associating with Haines carried a significant social risk. The turning point arrived through the absolute loyalty of Joan Crawford. She was one of the few massive stars who completely ignored the industry embargo. Crawford was fiercely protective of her own image and deeply insecure about her working-class origins. She trusted Haines implicitly, not just as a friend, but as the only man who understood how to construct a physical environment that matched the magnitude of her cinematic persona. She hired William Haines Designs to completely gut and remodel her Brentwood mansion. This was not a standard redecorating job. It was a highly strategic, high-stakes exhibition. Haines used Crawford's home as the prototype for an entirely new aesthetic movement that would soon be codified as Hollywood Regency. He systematically destroyed the oppressive, dark wood interiors that dominated California architecture. He tore down walls to create massive, flowing spaces. He painted the rooms in stark whites, vivid emerald greens, and soft, flattering pinks. He installed enormous wall-to-wall mirrors, not just to reflect light, but to reflect the massive egos of the people inhabiting the space. He understood that movie stars spent their days on sets designed to make them look flawless, only to return to homes that made them look ordinary. Haines solved this by designing residential spaces that functioned exactly like custom-built sound stages. The furniture he designed for Crawford was revolutionary. He recognized that traditional European seating was stiff and formal, incompatible with the relaxed, sprawling social habits of the California elite. He lowered the center of gravity of the entire room. He designed custom sofas and chairs that sat only a few inches off the ground. This was a brilliant piece of psychological engineering. When a woman in a bias-cut silk gown sat in a Haines chair, the low profile forced the fabric to drape perfectly around her legs, instantly transforming her into a portrait of casual elegance. When a male studio executive walked into a room featuring low-slung furniture, the forced perspective made him appear significantly taller and more commanding. Every lamp, every lacquered table, every hand-painted leather screen was meticulously engineered to flatter the inhabitant. When Crawford finally unveiled the redesigned mansion by hosting a massive industry party, the effect was seismic. The directors, producers, and rival stars who walked through her front door were struck by an environment of unparalleled aggressive glamour. They saw Crawford holding court in a living room that made her look like modern royalty. The dark, heavy mansions they returned to that night suddenly felt suffocating, outdated, and distinctly lower class. Haines had successfully infected the Hollywood elite with a desperate, overriding desire to upgrade their status. The psychological trap was set, but executing the sale required a masterful subversion of the standard business dynamic. When the phone at William Haines Designs finally began to ring, Haines did not answer with the obsequious gratitude of a blacklisted actor desperate for work. He answered with the lacerating disdain of a master dealing with uncultured peasants. He understood that the studio executives were surrounded by yes-men and sycophants who agreed with their every word. They were immune to flattery. The only thing they respected was power, and the only way to demonstrate power was through absolute, unapologetic abuse. When a powerful producer invited Haines to his home for a consultation, Haines would walk through the front door, survey the expensive, poorly arranged furniture, and openly insult the client's taste. He would refer to their living rooms as tasteless dungeons or expensive mausoleums. He told them their wives looked terrible in the lighting they had chosen. He demanded total, unquestioning creative control and refused to incorporate any of the client's existing possessions into his designs. If an executive argued over a price or questioned a fabric choice, Haines would simply walk out, telling them to call him when they were ready to stop living like barbarians. This strategy of aesthetic domination was breathtakingly effective. By treating the most powerful men in California with absolute contempt, he bypassed their defenses. They were terrified of being exposed as frauds, and Haines presented himself as the only man capable of curing their lack of class. They submitted to his insults because they desperately needed the validation his designs provided. The very men who had enforced the blacklist, who had barred him from the casting offices, and ordered the security guards to deny him entry to the studio lots, were now voluntarily handing him blank checks and begging him to fix their homes. The client list rapidly expanded from Crawford to include the absolute titans of the industry. George Cukor, Carol Lombard, and Norma Shearer contracted his services. He designed the interiors for the legendary Sunnylands estate. He was hired to decorate the American embassies in London and Paris. The business scaled massively, requiring a sprawling workshop in West Hollywood, employing dozens of artisans, upholsterers, and draftsmen. Jimmie Shields managed this exploding infrastructure with relentless precision, ensuring that the staggering amounts of money flowing into the company were securely invested and protected from the volatile economic fluctuations of the entertainment industry. They were generating a personal fortune that rapidly eclipsed the money Haines had earned during his peak years at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. More importantly, they had successfully built a parallel empire where Louis B. Mayer possessed absolutely zero jurisdiction. The studio chiefs could dictate who starred in a motion picture, but they could not dictate who a rival executive hired to design their dining room. The social embargo was completely shattered by the sheer force of capitalism. You could not shun William Haines if the most powerful hostess in Beverly Hills had just paid him $50,000 to design the room you were currently drinking in. Haines forced the industry to interact with him on his exact terms. He attended the same parties, walked through the same front doors, and navigated the same social circles from which he had been violently expelled. But he did so as an independent contractor holding absolute authority over their domestic lives. This was not merely a successful career pivot. It was a sustained, highly visible act of revenge executed through upholstery and architecture. Every hand-tooled leather desk he sold to a studio boss, every custom-dyed silk curtain he hung in a producer's screening room, was a physical reminder of his survival. He took the massive salaries they had stripped from him and extracted them back, dollar by dollar, multiplied tenfold by exploiting their deep-seated insecurities. He proved that the studio system was not omnipotent, The executives had attempted to erase him from history by destroying his cinematic image, completely failing to anticipate that he would simply redesign the physical reality they lived in. Haines and Shields had navigated the darkest, most violent consequences of their defiance and emerged in a position of untouchable power. They lived openly, unapologetically, in a magnificent home of their own design, funded by the frantic vanity of the people who had tried to ruin them. They had turned the ultimate mechanism of Hollywood control, the desperate need to project a flawless image, into their own personal printing press. The narrative of the tragic, discarded movie star had been entirely rewritten, replaced by the reality of two men who stared down a corporate monopoly, survived a lynch mob, and successfully forced an entire industry to pay a massive permanent premium for the privilege of their taste. By 1950, the monolithic studio system that had engineered William Haines's exile was beginning its own terminal collapse. The federal government had intervened, utilizing antitrust laws to dismantle the illegal oligopoly the studios held over theater chains. Simultaneously, the rapid proliferation of television sets in American living rooms decimated weekly box office attendance. The all-powerful monarchs of Culver City and Burbank, men who had once commanded the absolute obedience of thousands of employees, were suddenly scrambling to save their crumbling empires. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrant who had violently torn Haines's contract in half, was systematically stripped of his power and eventually forced out of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer by his own corporate board. As the executives who had enforced the blacklist fell into obsolescence, Haines and James Shields were operating at the absolute zenith of their architectural influence. They sat in their meticulously designed West Hollywood offices, entirely insulated from the panic gripping the film industry, watching the machine that had attempted to crush them slowly cannibalize itself. It was in this atmosphere of industry decay that Hollywood attempted to reclaim him. Director Billy Wilder was in the process of filming Sunset Boulevard, a dark, cynical masterpiece that ruthlessly dissected the psychological wreckage left behind by the studio system. Wilder was casting the role of the Waxworks, a group of forgotten, discarded silent film stars who gathered to play bridge with the delusional protagonist, Norma Desmond. He reached out to Haines, offering him a highly visible cameo. The offer was framed as an homage, a chance for a banished king to briefly return to the silver screen and receive the nostalgic applause of a new generation. For almost any other exiled actor, an invitation to appear in a major Paramount picture would have been a desperate, validating lifeline. Haines rejected the offer with absolute immediate finality. He did not harbor the tragic, lingering obsession with the camera that destroyed so many of his peers. He recognized Wilder's invitation for exactly what it was, an attempt to cast him in the narrative role of the tragic victim. Haines refused to be a relic. He sent a message back to the Paramount lot stating clearly that he was not a retired actor longing for a comeback, but a highly successful working interior designer. He had spent 15 years aggressively rewriting the script of his own life, successfully transforming himself from a disposable corporate asset into an independent dictator of style. Accepting a role as a forgotten ghost playing cards in a decaying mansion would validate the studio's original decree that his life effectively ended the day he walked out of Mayer's office. Haines denied Hollywood the satisfaction of pitying him. He chose his reality over their celluloid illusion, completely severing the final psychological chain connecting him to his past. The grand deception of the Golden Age was never truly about protecting the moral fabric of the public. It was a silent agreement to survive through total subjugation. Haines and Shields spent the next 2 decades aging with an immense, unshakable grace, their survival acting as the ultimate daily rebuke to a culture that had declared their relationship impossible. The final bill for that 47-year devotion was presented in 1973 when Haines died of cancer at age 73. Operating mechanically for exactly 70 days after losing his foundation, Shields put on a pair of Haines's pajamas, took a lethal overdose of sleeping pills, and left a brief note stating simply that he was too lonely. They were buried side by side in Woodlawn Cemetery. The legacy of William Haines is not found in the flickering reels of his silent comedies, nor entirely within the highly valued antique furniture circulating through global auction houses. His definitive masterpiece was his own existence. He stands as the singular anomaly of the Hollywood Golden Age, a man who held the absolute pinnacle of fame, recognized its soul-destroying conditions, and voluntarily threw it away. He laid bare the brutal machinery of an industry designed to crush authenticity, proving that a life lived in defiance is the only life actually worth owning. If you want to keep opening these closed cases where the truth was deliberately erased and the real price of survival was hidden from the public, you know what to do to avoid missing the next episode,